Judge Michael Harrison stood before the tall mirror in his chambers, adjusting the precisely starched collar of his black robe. Outside his door, the bustle of Monday morning traffic court filtered through. A symphony of shuffling feet, muffled conversations, and the occasional nervous cough. 20 years on the bench had taught him the sounds of anticipation and fear. The digital clock on his desk blinked 8:55 a.m. In 5 minutes, he would begin another week of maintaining order in Courtroom 302 of the Atlanta Municipal Court. His colleagues often joked that he could time an egg by his routine. Same arrival time, same coffee from the corner shop, same determined stride through the courthouse halls. Harrison ran his fingers across his clean-shaven jaw, scrutinizing his reflection. At 58, his hair had turned a distinguished silver at the temples, though his face remained relatively unlined save for the deep creases around his mouth. Evidence of years spent pressing his lips into a stern line of disapproval. The morning sun streamed through the bulletproof windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor of his chambers. 20 years, and he'd never been late. 20 years of upholding the law without compromise, of ensuring that every citizen who passed through his courtroom understood that actions had consequences. His clerk, Sarah Chen, knocked softly before entering with the day's docket. 43 cases this morning, Your Honor. Mostly traffic violations, 2 parking disputes, and 1 contested speeding ticket. She placed the files on his desk with practiced efficiency. 43 opportunities to restore order to our streets, Harrison remarked, picking up the first file. Sarah managed to keep her expression neutral, though she'd heard variations of this speech hundreds of times before. Will you need anything else, Your Honor? No, thank you, Sarah. Let's begin on time, as always. As Sarah left, Harrison allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. His reputation for punctuality and strict adherence to the law had earned him both respect and resentment among his peers. Some called him harsh, but he preferred to think of himself as consistent. In a world of increasing chaos, he stood as a barrier between order and anarchy, even if that meant dealing with traffic violations 1 ticket at a time. The wall clock struck 9, and Harrison gathered his robes around him. He moved toward the door connecting his chambers to the courtroom, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. Through the heavy wood, he could hear Bailiff Thompson's familiar voice. All rise. The Municipal Court of Atlanta, Traffic Division, is now in session, the Honorable Judge Michael Harrison presiding. Harrison waited for precisely 3 seconds, long enough for everyone to stand, before pushing open the door. He emerged onto the raised platform of his bench, surveying the morning's defendants with a practiced eye. The usual mix: young professionals checking their watches, retirees clutching their paperwork, teenagers accompanied by frustrated parents. Be seated, he intoned, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. The shuffle of movement rippled through the gallery as people sank into the worn wooden benches. Harrison settled into his chair, adjusting his microphone with precise movements. Sarah, call the first case. As his clerk began reading the name, Harrison allowed his gaze to sweep across the courtroom one final time. Everything was as it should be: orderly, controlled, predictable. He had no way of knowing that within the hour, his carefully constructed world would begin to crack at its foundations. Dr. Evelyn Carter gripped her steering wheel, glancing at the clock on her dashboard. 8:47 a.m. The morning had started perfectly at Frederick Douglass Elementary, where she'd spent an hour reading to wide-eyed third graders as part of her monthly community outreach program. The children's enthusiasm had made her linger longer than planned, their questions about justice and fairness striking a chord with her lifelong passion. Now that same passion had landed her in trouble. The blue lights in her rearview mirror had been an unwelcome surprise, and Officer Martinez had been apologetic but firm. 72 and a 55. No amount of explanation about her upcoming judicial conference would change the facts. She could have shown her credentials. The gold badge that identified her as Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court would have ended the situation immediately. But that wasn't who Evelyn Carter was. 25 years of climbing through the judicial ranks, of being the first black woman in nearly every room she entered, had taught her valuable lessons about power and its application. Pulling into the courthouse parking lot, she smoothed her charcoal gray dress. Casual by her usual standards but appropriate for the morning's reading session. Her usual judicial robes hung in her office across town, waiting for the afternoon's conference. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. In 6 hours, she would be delivering a keynote speech about judicial integrity to every traffic court judge in the state. The courthouse security guard, an elderly man named Bill, did a double take as she passed through the metal detector. "Dr. Carter, is everything all right?" "Just a minor traffic matter, Bill," she smiled, warmth radiating from her deep brown eyes. "Sometimes we all need a reminder to slow down." The hallway leading to Courtroom 302 was packed with other citizens waiting their turn before the bench. Evelyn found a seat on a wooden bench, placing her briefcase beside her. A young mother struggling with a fussy baby caught her attention, and she quietly offered her bottle of water and a clean tissue from her purse. "First time here," the mother whispered, grateful for the kindness. "In this particular courtroom, yes," Evelyn replied, choosing her words carefully. "I've heard Judge Harrison runs a tight ship." "My brother says he's tough," the young mother nodded. "Never lets anyone explain themselves. Just hands out maximum fines like they're candy." Evelyn absorbed this information, her judicial mind already analyzing the patterns of behavior such a reputation suggested. In her position, she'd seen how power could corrupt gradually, how the weight of authority could slowly bend a person's perspective until they forgot the humanity of those who stood before them. The courtroom doors opened, and Bailiff Thompson's voice carried into the hallway, calling for order. As the crowd filed in, Evelyn took a moment to center herself. She could handle this situation one of two ways: reveal her position and watch the inevitable scramble of apologies, or experience the system as any other citizen would. The choice was clear. Finding a seat in the middle row, she observed Judge Harrison's entrance with professional interest. His rigid posture, the calculated pause before sitting, the slight lift of his chin as he surveyed the room. Every gesture spoke of a man who had perhaps grown too comfortable with his authority. As the first cases were called, Evelyn pulled out her citation and waited. Soon, she would see firsthand how justice was being served in this corner of her jurisdiction. Docket number 47,852, Dr. Evelyn Carter. Sarah Chen's clear voice cut through the murmur of the courtroom. The clerk's eyes flickered with brief surprise as she read the credentials on the citation, but she maintained her professional demeanor. Dr. Carter rose gracefully, straightening her dress as she approached the podium. Judge Harrison barely glanced up from his papers, his pen tapping an impatient rhythm on his desk. The morning had proceeded exactly as he'd expected. 28 cases, 28 fines, no contests successful. "Dr. Carter, you're charged with driving 72 miles per hour in a 55 zone on Peachtree Street. How do you plead?" His tone carried the bored efficiency of someone who'd already decided the outcome. "Your Honor, I'd like to explain the circumstances." "The question, Dr. Carter, was how do you plead?" Harrison interrupted, finally looking up. His eyes narrowed slightly as they met hers, taking in her professional bearing that seemed at odds with the typical traffic court defendant. "Guilty, Your Honor, but I would appreciate the opportunity to provide context. The speed limit signs on Peachtree Street are clearly posted." Harrison cut in again, his voice taking on an edge that made several observers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "They're not suggestions, Dr. Carter. They're laws." The corner of Dr. Carter's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. 25 years of legal experience told her exactly what was happening, and her academic mind was already cataloging every microaggression, every interruption, every subtle shift in tone. "I'm well aware of traffic laws, Your Honor, as I was attempting to explain. Then you should be equally aware that your credentials, whatever they may be, don't exempt you from following them." Harrison's voice rose slightly, carrying the hint of satisfaction that came with putting someone in their place. This court sees many professionals who seem to think their education places them above the law. A soft murmur rippled through the gallery. The young mother from the hallway watched with wide eyes, her baby mercifully quiet. Bailiff Thompson, who had served in this courtroom for over a decade, found himself studying his shoes, unable to watch what was unfolding. Dr. Carter stood perfectly still, her posture revealing nothing but calm dignity. When she spoke again, her voice carried the quiet authority that had earned her reputation as one of the most respected jurists in the state. Your Honor, I was returning from a community service event at Frederick Douglass Elementary, where Dr. Carter, Harrison's tone dripped with condescension now. This court's time is valuable. Your community service, while admirable, does not excuse breaking the law. The citation clearly states, "If you would allow me to finish a sentence, Your Honor," Dr. Carter interjected, her words precise and measured. "You might find the complete information relevant to your deliberation." The courtroom fell silent. Even Sarah Chen stopped typing, her fingers frozen above her keyboard. No one interrupted Judge Harrison. Not in his courtroom, not in his domain. Harrison's face flushed slightly as he leaned forward, his knuckles widening as he gripped his gavel. "Dr. Carter, you are very close to contempt. Your attitude suggests a distinct lack of respect for this court's authority." A ghost of a smile touched Dr. Carter's lips. The irony of his statement would become apparent soon enough. For now, she simply nodded, her silence more eloquent than any response. "Given your lack of regard for both traffic laws and proper courtroom decorum," Harrison continued, his voice carrying the finality of a man certain of his power, "this court finds it appropriate to impose the maximum fine. The fine will be $750. Judge Harrison's voice carried the weight of finality as he scribbled on the citation. "Plus court costs." He paused, glancing at Dr. Carter over his reading glasses. "Unless you'd like to explain again how your community service should earn you special consideration." The sarcasm in his tone drew a few uncomfortable coughs from the gallery. Sarah Chen, the clerk, kept her eyes fixed on her computer screen, her fingers moving across the keyboard with unnecessary force. In her 15 years of service, she'd never felt more uneasy about a proceeding. Dr. Carter reached into her briefcase and withdrew her checkbook with deliberate slowness. The leather cover bore the seal of the state of Georgia, a detail that went unnoticed by Harrison, but caused Sarah's typing to falter for a moment. "No, Your Honor," Dr. Carter replied, her voice carrying a calm that seemed to settle over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. "I believe you've made your position quite clear." She began writing the check, each stroke of her pen measured and precise. The scratch of her writing was the only sound in the otherwise silent room. Harrison watched her with growing irritation. Her composure was unsettling. Defendants usually showed anger, pleaded for leniency, or at least displayed some sign of distress at the maximum fine. But Dr. Carter's demeanor suggested someone who saw this moment as something more than a simple traffic violation. "I trust this experience will encourage more careful attention to traffic laws in the future," Harrison added, unable to resist one final jab. "The citizens of Atlanta deserve to feel safe on their streets." Dr. Carter finished writing the check and held it up to the light, as if checking for errors. "Indeed, Your Honor, citizens deserve many things from their judicial system." She approached the clerk's desk and handed the check to Sarah with a gentle smile, safety being just one of them. Something in her tone made Harrison shift in his seat. There was a weight to her words that he couldn't quite place, a subtle emphasis that suggested layers of meaning beyond their surface. "If there's nothing else," Harrison began, reaching for his gavel. "Actually, Your Honor," Dr. Carter interrupted, reaching into her briefcase again, "I believe you'll find this relevant to our proceedings." She withdrew a business card and handed it to Sarah, who glanced at it and visibly paled. "The court has already made its ruling, Dr. Carter. If you wish to appeal—" "Oh, no appeal will be necessary," Dr. Carter interjected smoothly. "I simply wanted to ensure proper documentation for this morning's." Learning experience. She turned slightly, addressing both the judge and the gallery. After all, it's not every day that a Chief Justice gets to observe traffic court from such a unique perspective. The gavel slipped from Harrison's fingers, clattering against his desk. Sarah Chen's sharp intake of breath seemed to echo through the courtroom. In the gallery, the young mother with the baby pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes wide with realization. Chief Justice. Harrison's voice had lost all its previous authority, reduced to a hoarse whisper. Of the Georgia Supreme Court, yes, Dr. Carter confirmed, gathering her belongings. And now, if you'll excuse me, I have a judicial conference to attend. She paused at the gate separating the gallery from the court proper. I believe you're scheduled to be there as well, Judge Harrison. The topic is, rather appropriately, bias and equity in traffic court proceedings. 2 hours later, Judge Harrison stood in the marble foyer of the State Judicial Conference Center, tugging at his bow tie. The morning's events had left him distracted, causing him to nearly clip a garbage truck on his drive-over. He'd changed into his formal attire in record time, barely registering the concerned looks from his colleagues as he rushed through the building's ornate entrance. Michael. Judge Patricia Reynolds called out, waving him over to a cluster of fellow traffic court judges. We saved you a seat up front. Harrison forced a smile, his collar suddenly feeling too tight. Actually, I think I'll sit toward the back today. Better view of the presentations. But they're recognizing your 20 years on the bench, Patricia protested. Surely you want to. The room fell silent as the main doors opened. Dr. Evelyn Carter swept in, now wearing her formal judicial robes, the gold embroidery on her sleeves catching the light. Gone was the casual dress from traffic court, replaced by the full regalia of her office. A small entourage of clerks and assistants followed in her wake, carrying folders and tablets. Harrison felt his knees weaken. From his new vantage point at the back of the room, he watched as she graciously greeted various judicial officials, many of whom seemed eager to catch her attention. Her warm laugh carried across the room as she spoke with the Attorney General, showing no sign of their earlier encounter. If everyone could please take their seats, the conference director announced, we're honored to begin today's session with remarks from our Chief Justice, Dr. Evelyn Carter. The applause was immediate and genuine. Harrison sank into his chair, acutely aware of how the morning's events might unfold before his peers. His hands felt clammy as he gripped the conference program, his own name listed among those to be honored for service. Dr. Carter approached the podium with measured steps, her presence commanding the room's complete attention. She adjusted the microphone, surveyed the audience, and smiled, the same composed smile she'd worn in his courtroom. Distinguished colleagues, she began, her voice carrying effortlessly through the sound system. Today, we gather to discuss a matter close to my heart, the intersection of justice and humanity in our courts. Harrison's throat went dry as she continued. This morning, I had an enlightening experience that I'd like to share with you all. She paused, her eyes scanning the room. I participated in what we might call an impromptu field study of our traffic court system. A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Harrison slid lower in his seat. What I observed was fascinating. A perfect case study in how power, when unchecked by empathy, can corrupt even the most routine proceedings. She didn't look at Harrison, but he felt every word like a physical blow. I stood before a judge who never once allowed me to complete a sentence, who assumed, based on nothing but his own preconceptions, that I was seeking special treatment rather than attempting to provide relevant context. The room had grown so quiet that Harrison could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning. Several judges were now glancing around, trying to identify the subject of her story. This judge, Dr. Carter continued, her voice taking on a gentle but firm tone, demonstrated exactly why we're gathered here today. Because justice isn't just about applying the law. It's about hearing every voice, considering every circumstance, and remembering that behind every case number stands a human being worthy of respect. In the back row, Judge Harrison closed his eyes, the weight of his morning decisions pressing down on him like a physical force. The day of reckoning had arrived, and it was being delivered with a grace he knew he hadn't earned. Each word from Dr. Carter's speech hammered against Judge Harrison's consciousness like a gavel, his own gavel, the one he'd wielded so carelessly hours before. The elegant ballroom of the Judicial Conference Center, with its crystal chandeliers and mahogany panels, felt more like a courtroom now. Only this time, he was the one being judged. In our position of authority, Dr. Carter continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, it's easy to forget that true justice requires more than merely applying the law. It demands wisdom to understand context, courage to acknowledge our biases, and humility to recognize when we fail to meet these standards. Harrison's collar felt like it was choking him. He watched as his colleagues nodded in agreement, some taking notes, others leaning forward in their seats. Judge Patricia Reynolds, seated 3 rows ahead, was practically beaming with admiration at Dr. Carter's words. This morning, Dr. Carter's tone shifted slightly, causing Harrison's stomach to clench. I witnessed a judge interrupt a citizen no less than 7 times during a simple traffic hearing. Each interruption carried a clear message. Your voice doesn't matter here. Your context is irrelevant. Your humanity is secondary to my authority. The memory of each interruption now played back in Harrison's mind with painful clarity. He saw himself through new eyes, not as the pillar of justice he'd imagined, but as something far more troubling. The way he'd cut her off, the satisfaction he'd felt in asserting his authority, the assumptions he'd made without a moment's hesitation. Let me be clear, Dr. Carter continued, her voice taking on a gentler tone that somehow made her words even more powerful. This isn't about a traffic ticket. It's about what happens when we forget that the power we hold is a trust, not a right. When we allow our benches to become barriers rather than bridges to understanding. A drop of sweat rolled down Harrison's back. Around him, other judges shifted in their seats, perhaps recognizing pieces of themselves in her words. But none of them had spent their morning treating the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court like an errant schoolgirl. I chose not to identify myself this morning, she went on, drawing murmurs from the crowd. Not to set a trap, but to understand. To experience our system as our citizens do. To feel what it's like when justice becomes a monologue rather than a dialogue. Harrison found himself nodding unconsciously, his earlier defenses crumbling with each carefully chosen word. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a physical force. He thought of every defendant he'd dismissed over the years, every explanation he'd cut short, every time he'd chosen efficiency over empathy. The judge I encountered today will likely recognize himself in these words, Dr. Carter said, her gaze sweeping the room without lingering on him. And when he does, I hope he understands that this moment isn't about shame. It's about growth, about recognizing that every time we don this robe, we make a choice about what kind of justice we'll deliver. The room erupted in applause, but Harrison barely heard it over the roaring in his ears. 20 years on the bench, and only now did he truly understand what it meant to sit in judgment. The irony was almost too much to bear. He'd spent his career believing he was upholding justice, only to have justice herself show him how far he'd strayed from its true meaning. As Dr. Carter moved on to other topics, Harrison remained frozen in his seat, experiencing his own version of judicial review, not of cases or precedents, but of the man he'd become and the judge he needed to be. The conference broke for lunch at precisely noon. Judge Harrison stood in a corner of the reception hall, holding a plate he couldn't bring himself to fill. Colleagues moved around him like water around a stone, their animated conversations about Dr. Carter's speech adding to his discomfort. Judge Harrison, her voice, so different from the deferential tone she'd used in his courtroom, made him nearly drop his plate. Dr. Carter stood before him, holding 2 cups of coffee. She extended one toward him. Black, 2 sugars, according to your clerk, Sarah. She's quite protective of you, despite everything. Harrison accepted the coffee with trembling hands. Dr. Carter, I don't know where to begin. The beginning is usually a good place, she replied, gesturing toward a quiet alcove away from the crowd. Though in this case, perhaps we should start with why a judge with 20 years' experience felt the need to assert his authority so forcefully over a simple traffic violation. They settled into 2 armchairs, the elegant fabric a far cry from the hard wooden benches of his courtroom. Harrison stared into his coffee cup as if it might contain the right words. "I've been sitting here, trying to formulate an appropriate apology," he began. "I'm not interested in apologies, Judge Harrison," Dr. Carter interrupted, though her tone was gentle. "I'm interested in understanding. Tell me, what did you see when I stood before your bench this morning?" The question caught him off guard. "I saw." He paused, forcing himself to be honest. "I saw someone who I assumed thought they were above the law. Someone who needed to be reminded of their place." "Their place," Dr. Carter repeated softly. "And you saw it as your duty to remind them. Remind me of that place." Looking back now, I realize what I actually saw were my own prejudices. Harrison's voice cracked slightly. "I saw what I expected to see, not who was actually standing before me." Dr. Carter took a sip of her coffee, studying him over the rim of her cup. "Do you know why I didn't identify myself this morning?" Harrison shook his head. "Because the moment I did, everything would have changed. The way you spoke to me, looked at me, treated me, it would all have shifted. And that shift, Judge Harrison, that's what we need to examine. Because justice shouldn't depend on who someone is, but on what the facts and circumstances tell us." "I've always prided myself on being fair," Harrison said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "Fair according to whose definition?" Dr. Carter leaned forward. "The law provides guidelines, Judge Harrison, not blinders. When you refused to let me explain about the elementary school reading program, about running late for this very conference, you weren't upholding justice. You were exercising power." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. How many others had he silenced? How many contexts had he dismissed? How many times had he confused authority with justice? "The question now," Dr. Carter continued, placing her empty cup aside, "is what you plan to do with this realization. Because moments like these, Judge Harrison, they're crossroads. You can either see this as an embarrassing incident to be buried and forgotten, or Harrison found himself holding his breath, or you can see it as an opportunity to become the kind of judge who truly serves justice, not just the letter of the law, but its spirit. The kind of judge who remembers that behind every case number is a human story waiting to be heard." 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of Courtroom 302, but everything else had changed. Judge Michael Harrison sat at his bench, listening intently as a young mother explained why she'd run a red light. Her child had been having an asthma attack, and a hospital was just 2 blocks away. "Your Honor," Sarah Chin, his clerk, handed him the woman's driving record. "No prior violations." Harrison nodded, studying the woman's face. 6 months ago, he would have cut her explanation short, quoted the statute, and imposed the fine. Now he heard not just words, but the story behind them. "Ms. Rodriguez," he spoke, his voice carrying none of its former harsh authority. "Running a red light is serious. However, given the medical emergency and your clean record, I'm going to reduce the fine and recommend a defensive driving course instead." The relief on her face reminded him of why he'd made the changes to his courtroom. The rigid rows of benches had been rearranged in a more open configuration. The imposing barrier between him and defendants had been lowered. Small changes, but they sent a message. This was a place of justice, not just judgment. During his lunch break, Harrison made his way to the courthouse library, where he'd started hosting monthly forums for traffic court judges. Today's topic was compassionate justice, balancing law and humanity. As he entered, he saw Dr. Carter sitting quietly in the back row. "Please, continue," she smiled, gesturing for him to begin. Harrison faced his colleagues, many of whom had been skeptical of his transformation at first. 6 months ago, I received the most important traffic citation of my career," he began, drawing knowing chuckles from those who'd heard the story. But what I really received was a wake-up call. He clicked to the first slide, a photo of his old courtroom setup. This was my fortress. I thought justice needed walls, barriers, distance. I couldn't have been more wrong. As he continued his presentation, sharing case studies and statistical improvements in compliance rates since implementing his new approach, he noticed Dr. Carter nodding approvingly. His courtroom now had one of the lowest appeal rates in the state, and more importantly, the highest rate of voluntary fine payment. The law hasn't changed, he explained, showing before and after surveys from defendants, but how we apply it has. Every case that comes before us is more than just a violation. It's a story that deserves to be heard. After the forum, Dr. Carter approached him. "Your Honor," she said, emphasizing his title with a warm smile, "I believe you found your true calling as a teacher." Harrison shook his head. "I'm still learning myself. Every day, I discover something new about what justice really means." "That's exactly why you're the right person to teach others," she replied. "Because you remember what it was like to be on both sides of that bench." As they walked toward the exit, they passed a framed photo recently hung in the courthouse lobby. Judge Harrison and Dr. Carter at a community justice forum, working together to reform traffic court procedures across the state. "You know," Harrison said, pausing to look at the photo, "that traffic ticket was expensive." "Oh," Dr. Carter raised an eyebrow. "Yes," he smiled. "It cost me my arrogance, my prejudices, and my comfortable certainties. Best fine I ever paid." Dr. Carter laughed, the sound echoing through the marble halls where justice, in its truest form, had finally found its home. "Some lessons, Judge Harrison, are priceless."